Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. The badge on my chest read Deputy K. Mitchell, Jefferson County Sheriff's Office, Alabama. 2 years ago, on a humid Tuesday in August, I was working the evening shift, patrolling the stretch of Highway 31 that runs through our jurisdiction. I'd been with the department for 8 years at that point, had a wife named Sarah and twin daughters who'd just turned 5. Life was good, you know, predictable in the way small-town law enforcement usually is. Traffic stops, domestic disputes, the occasional drunk driver. I loved my job, loved serving my community, loved coming home to my girls every night. That Tuesday started like any other shift. Me grabbing coffee from the marathon station where old Mrs. Henderson always had a fresh pot brewing, checking in with dispatch, then heading out to patrol. The sun was starting to dip low, painting everything in that golden Alabama light that makes even the ugliest strip mall look beautiful. Around 7:30 p.m., I was cruising past the Chevron station near mile marker 47 when I spotted this beat-up Honda Civic weaving between lanes like the driver was playing some twisted game of highway hopscotch. The car would drift left, jerk back right, then speed up before slowing down again. Classic signs of impaired driving, or maybe someone texting. I flipped on my lights and hit the siren, expecting the usual routine. Pull them over, check for signs of intoxication, maybe write a ticket. The Civic took its sweet time responding, continuing for another quarter mile before finally pulling into the Chevron parking lot. I remember thinking it was odd they chose to stop there instead of the shoulder, but figured maybe they wanted to be off the main road. I radioed dispatch with my location and the plate number, standard procedure. The gas station was busy, people filling up after work, kids running in for snacks while their parents pumped gas. I approached the vehicle with my hand resting on my holster, another standard precaution we're trained to take. The driver's window was already rolling down as I got closer, and I could see a young guy behind the wheel, maybe 19 or 20, wearing a faded crimson-tied cap pulled low. His passenger seat was cluttered with fast food wrappers and energy drink cans, and there was this weird chemical smell coming from inside. Not weed, not alcohol, something sharper. "License and registration," I said, keeping my voice calm but firm. The kid's hands were gripping the steering wheel so tight his knuckles had gone white, and he kept glancing at his rearview mirror, then at me, then back at the mirror. "I wasn't doing nothing wrong," he said, his voice cracking like he was younger than he looked. "Just trying to get home." When he reached for his glove compartment, his movements were jerky, unnatural, like he was fighting against his own muscles. The registration was expired by 6 months, and when he handed me his license, I noticed his hand had this tremor to it. Not fear exactly, something else. Marcus Thompson, age 19, from Birmingham. I asked him to step out of the vehicle while I ran his information, and that's when things started going sideways. "Why I gotta get out?" he asked, his voice getting louder, more aggressive. "I know my rights, man. You can't just make me get out for no reason." I explained that I'd observed him driving erratically and needed to ensure he was safe to operate the vehicle. He started arguing, saying I was profiling him, that cops always hassled him for no reason. The chemical smell was stronger now with his window fully down, and I could see his pupils were dilated, despite the bright overhead lights of the gas station. More cars were pulling in, people starting to notice the traffic stop, some pulling out their phones. I kept my voice level, professional, but Marcus was getting more agitated by the second, his words coming faster, sometimes not even making sense. I called for backup, not because I couldn't handle one agitated teenager, but because the situation was escalating in a public place with civilians around. Deputy Jim Hawkins responded that he was 5 minutes out. Jim and I had been partners on and off for 6 years. He'd been the one who trained me when I first joined the department. Good man, coached Little League on weekends, had a son about Marcus's age. While waiting for Jim, I kept trying to de-escalate, asking Marcus about where he was headed, if everything was okay at home, just trying to bring the temperature down. But he wasn't having it. He kept fidgeting in his seat, reaching toward the center console, then pulling his hand back, muttering under his breath. "Sir, I need you to keep your hands where I can see them," I said, taking a step back from the vehicle. That's when I noticed the edge of something metallic poking out from under a wadded-up hoodie on his passenger floorboard. Could have been anything, a tool, a piece of car equipment, but given his behavior, I wasn't taking chances. Jim's cruiser pulled up behind mine just as Marcus suddenly pushed his door open and stepped out without being asked. He was taller than I'd expected, maybe 6'2", wearing baggy jeans and a white tank top that showed arms covered in amateur tattoos. "Man, I'm tired of this," he said, pacing back and forth next to his car, his movements sharp and unpredictable. "Y'all always messing with people for nothing." Jim approached from the passenger side, giving me a quick nod. We'd done this dance before. One officer maintains contact while the other provides cover and watches for threats. The crowd was growing now, maybe 15 or 20 people watching from various distances, some still pumping gas but with their eyes glued to us. I heard someone say something about another one, and here we go again. The tension in that parking lot was thick enough to cut, everyone waiting to see what would happen next. Marcus kept pacing, his rants getting louder, more incoherent, something about the government and chemicals and how we didn't understand what was really going on. "Marcus, I need you to calm down," Jim said in that steady voice of his, the one that had talked down hundreds of volatile situations over the years. "Nobody wants any trouble here. Let's just figure this out so everyone can go home safe." But Marcus wasn't listening anymore. His eyes kept darting between us, the crowd, his car, like he was calculating something. Then, in one quick motion, he dove back toward the passenger side of his vehicle. I saw him reaching for that metallic object under the hoodie, and time seemed to slow down. "Gun!" I shouted, drawing my weapon as Jim did the same. Everything after that happened in seconds, but felt like hours. Marcus came up with what looked like a chrome pistol, his arm swinging in our direction. The first shot, I'll never know who fired it, shattered the night air, followed immediately by several more. The sound was deafening, echoing off the gas station canopy, mixing with screams from bystanders diving for cover behind cars and gas pumps. I felt the heat of a round pass by my left ear, so close I could hear the whistle of displaced air. My training kicked in. Find cover, return fire only if you have a clear shot, protect civilians. I dropped behind the rear of Marcus's car while Jim took position behind our cruiser. Marcus had ducked down behind his open passenger door, occasionally popping up to fire wild shots that shattered the gas station windows and sparked off the concrete. "Drop the weapon," I kept shouting, even though I knew he probably couldn't hear me over the gunfire and screaming. A woman was trapped between two gas pumps, frozen in terror, and I could see a family huddled inside a minivan 20 feet away. The smell of gunpowder mixed with spilled gasoline from a pump that had been hit. Jim was returning fire in controlled bursts, trying to keep Marcus pinned while minimizing the risk to bystanders. I saw him lean out from behind the cruiser to get a better angle, and that's when it happened. Marcus fired 3 quick shots that caught Jim in the upper chest, just above his vest. Jim went down hard, his weapon clattering across the pavement. I watched my partner, my friend, my mentor crumple to the ground, blood already pooling beneath him. Raw fury mixed with training as I moved to a better position, putting myself between Marcus and the civilians still trapped in the vicinity. "Officer down!" I screamed into my radio, barely able to hear the dispatcher's response over the chaos. More sirens were approaching, but they seemed so far away. Marcus had gone quiet, no more wild shots, and I couldn't see him from my position. Every second stretched like an eternity as I tried to process what was happening. Jim wasn't moving, civilians were still in danger, and I had no idea if Marcus was reloading, repositioning, or planning something worse. The chemical smell from his car was even stronger now, making my eyes water. I risked a quick glance around the bumper and saw him crawling toward the front of his vehicle, the gun still in his hand. That's when I made the hardest decision of my career. With Jim down and civilians at risk, I couldn't wait for backup. I came up firing, putting 3-round center mass as Marcus tried to raise his weapon again. He dropped instantly, the chrome pistol skittering across the oil-stained concrete. The sudden silence was almost worse than the gunfire. Just the hum of the gas station lights, distant sirens, and my own ragged breathing. I kept my weapon trained on Marcus as I moved toward Jim, kicking the suspect's gun away from his motionless form. Jim's eyes were open but unfocused, blood soaking through his uniform shirt. I pressed my hands against the wounds, screaming for someone to help, to call an ambulance, even though I knew units were already racing our way. A woman in scrubs, a nurse who'd been filling up her car, ran over despite the danger, dropping to her knees beside me to help with first aid. But I could see it in her eyes, the same thing I was seeing. Jim was gone. My partner of 6 years, the man who'd taught me everything about being a good cop, who'd been planning his son's high school graduation party just last week, was gone. The next few hours were a blur of flashing lights, crime scene tape, and questions from what seemed like every law enforcement agency in the state. The gas station became a maze of evidence markers, each little yellow number representing a bullet hole, a shell casing, a piece of the nightmare that had unfolded. They took my weapon for the investigation, standard procedure, and I sat in the back of an ambulance while paramedics checked me over, finding cuts from flying glass I didn't even know I had. The whole time I kept replaying those seconds in my mind. Could I have done something different? Should I have waited for Jim before approaching the car? Why didn't I see the gun sooner? But the worst part was watching them load Jim's body into the coroner's van, knowing I'd have to face his wife Lisa, his son Tyler, and explain how I'd let their hero die. The nurse who'd tried to help, her name was Melissa, stayed with me until my captain arrived, holding my hand while I gave my initial statement through tears I couldn't stop. Here's the part that still makes my gut twist. Marcus Thompson didn't die that night. My shots had hit him, but he survived, spending 3 weeks in the ICU before being transferred to county jail. The investigation revealed that the chemical smell in his car was from methamphetamine production materials, and he'd been high during our encounter. His gun turned out to be stolen from a home invasion 2 counties over, but none of that mattered to our community, which erupted into chaos over the shooting. Half the town called me a hero for stopping a dangerous criminal and protecting innocent lives. The other half painted Marcus as a victim of police aggression, a troubled kid who needed help, not bullets. His family hired attorneys, held press conferences, showed pictures of him from high school when he'd been on the honor roll before drugs took hold. They said we escalated the situation, that 2 trained officers should have been able to handle 1 teenager without anyone dying. The protests started within days, people marching past the sheriff's office with signs bearing Jim's picture on one side and Marcus's on the other, as if their deaths were equivalent somehow. The trial, when it finally came 18 months later, tore our town completely apart. I testified for hours about that night, reliving every second under cross-examination from defense attorneys who picked apart each decision, each word, each moment. Marcus, now clean and looking nothing like the wild-eyed kid from that night, sat quietly in his wheelchair. My shots had damaged his spine, leaving him partially paralyzed. He was convicted of first-degree murder for Jim's death, attempted murder for shooting at me, and various drug charges, life without parole. His mother wailed in the courtroom while Jim's widow sat stone-faced, Tyler beside her wearing his father's badge on a chain around his neck. The protests continued even after the verdict, people choosing sides like it was a football game, instead of a tragedy that destroyed multiple families. I went back to work eventually, but nothing was the same. Every traffic stop made my heart race. Every reach for a wallet or phone made me tense. I see Jim in my dreams, sometimes saving him, sometimes watching him die over and over. Marcus's family filed a civil suit that's still pending, claiming excessive force, seeking millions the county doesn't have. The gas station where it happened closed down 6 months later, Nobody wanted to fill up where blood had been spilled. I drive past that empty lot every day on patrol, a concrete reminder of how 30 seconds of violence can echo through a community forever. Sarah says I'm different now, quieter, and she's right. Some nights I stand in my daughter's doorway, watching them sleep, thinking about Tyler Hawkins, who will never see his dad again, about Marcus Thompson's little sister who visits him in prison, about how many lives can shatter in the time it takes to empty a magazine. The call came through dispatch at 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon in early November. I'd been a patrol officer in Buffalo for nearly 20 years, and welfare checks were routine, usually concerned neighbors worried about elderly folks who hadn't collected their mail in a few days. The address was on Elmwood Avenue, one of those quiet suburban streets where people still left their porch lights on for trick-or-treaters and knew each other's dogs by name. I remember thinking it would be a quick check, maybe find someone who'd fallen and couldn't reach the phone, get them some help, and be back on patrol within the hour. God, how wrong I was about that. When I pulled up to 1847 Elmwood, nothing looked unusual from the outside. It was a 2-story colonial pale yellow siding with forest green shutters, the kind of house that blended seamlessly into the neighborhood. The lawn was neat, leaves raked into tidy piles along the sidewalk. A man in his early 30s answered the door before I even had a chance to knock. He must have been watching through the window. He introduced himself as Nathan Holloway, wearing a cable-knit sweater and khakis, looking like he'd just stepped out of a J. Crew catalog. His smile was warm, practiced, the kind you see on real estate agents. He invited me in immediately, which should have been my first real warning sign. Most people are nervous when cops show up, even for welfare checks. Not Nathan. The interior was immaculate, almost sterile in its cleanliness. The air smelled heavily of pine sol and something else underneath, a metallic scent I couldn't quite place. Nathan explained that his elderly uncle Walter lived with him in the basement apartment. The neighbor who'd called was worried because Walter usually walked his beagle every morning at 7 a.m. sharp, but no one had seen him for almost 2 weeks. Nathan laughed, running his hand through his perfectly styled brown hair, and said Uncle Walter had been feeling under the weather lately. Nothing serious, just keeping to himself. He offered to take me downstairs to check on him, leading the way through the kitchen to a door beside the pantry. That's when I saw the padlock. It wasn't a small lock either, one of those heavy-duty master locks you'd use on a storage unit. The hasp was new, the screw holes in the wood still showing fresh splinters. Nathan must have noticed me staring because he immediately launched into an explanation. Uncle Walter had dementia, he said, and had started wandering at night. The lock was for his own safety, to keep him from falling down the stairs. He fumbled with his keys, making a show of looking for the right one, all while maintaining that salesman's smile. The basement door was solid oak, no window, and I noticed scratch marks near the handle, deep gouges in the wood that looked deliberately made. Nathan was still talking, something about doctor's orders and family decisions, but I'd already made up my mind. I stepped back and told him I'd need to verify his uncle's welfare directly, that it was standard procedure. His smile never wavered, but I saw his jaw tighten just for a second. I excused myself and walked back to my patrol car, keeping my movements casual. Nathan followed me to the front door, still chatting about his uncle's medical history, medications, how hard it was to care for aging relatives. I nodded along while keying my radio. Unit 23 requesting backup at 1847 Elmwood for a welfare check. Non-emergency, but I need a second officer on scene. Dispatch confirmed, estimating 5 minutes for the nearest unit. I told Nathan I'd wait outside for my partner, department policy for welfare checks involving locked areas. He didn't argue, just maintained that pleasant expression and closed the door. Through the living room window, I watched him pace back and forth, pulling out his phone and typing furiously. The curtains twitched in what I assumed was the basement window, a small ground-level rectangle covered with newspaper from the inside. Officer Mike Chen arrived in 4 minutes, parking behind my cruiser. I'd worked with Mike before. He was young, but had good instincts. I briefed him quickly. Elderly man hadn't been seen in 2 weeks. Nephew acting cooperative but suspicious. Basement door padlocked from the outside. Mike's eyebrows went up at that last detail. We approached the house together, and this time Nathan took longer to answer. When he did, his sweater was slightly askew, and there was a sheen of sweat on his forehead despite the cool November air. He protested when I told him we needed immediate access to the basement, citing privacy rights and threatening to call his lawyer. I explained that given the circumstances, the unusual lock, the length of time since anyone had seen Walter, the welfare check request, we had reasonable cause for concern. Nathan's facade finally cracked. His voice went cold, flat, nothing like the cheerful homeowner who'd greeted me 20 minutes earlier. "You need a warrant," he said, trying to close the door. Mike stepped forward, keeping it open with his boot. I made the call then. Exigent circumstances, possible elder abuse or endangerment. I told Nathan we were coming in, and he could either unlock that basement door or we'd cut the lock. For a moment, nobody moved. Nathan's eyes darted between us, calculating. Then he shrugged, reached into his pocket, and pulled out a ring of keys. But instead of moving toward the basement door, he dropped them on the floor and bolted toward the back of the house. Mike went after him while I rushed to the kitchen, grabbing the keys. My hands were steady as I found the right key. A newer one, brass-colored among the older silver ones. The lock clicked open and I pulled the door wide, immediately hit by a wave of stale air and human waste. The smell nearly knocked me backward. I called out, "Walter, Buffalo Police, we're here to help." No response. The wooden stairs creaked under my weight as I descended, one hand on my radio, the other hovering near my service weapon. The basement was dimly lit by a single bulb hanging from the ceiling, casting harsh shadows across concrete walls. At first, I couldn't process what I was seeing. The space had been divided into sections with plastic sheeting, like a makeshift construction zone. Behind the first sheet, I saw him. Not an elderly man, but someone in his 40s, zip-tied to a metal folding chair. His mouth was covered with duct tape, eyes wild and pleading when they met mine. His clothes were soiled, and I could see infected sores on his wrists where the plastic ties had cut into his skin. This wasn't Walter. This was someone else entirely. I rushed forward, telling him he was safe now, that help was coming, while calling for ambulance and additional units on my radio. The man was trying to speak through the tape, making urgent muffled sounds and jerking his head toward the back of the basement. That's when I heard Mike shout from upstairs, followed by a crash. I had to make a choice: help the victim or back up my partner. The man in the chair was frantically shaking his head, eyes wide with terror, looking past me. I turned just as Nathan came charging down the stairs, wielding what looked like a crowbar. He must have circled back through another entrance. The metal bar caught the overhead light as he swung it toward my head. I ducked, feeling the air whoosh past my ear, and the crowbar smashed into the concrete wall with a clang that reverberated through the basement. Nathan's face was completely transformed. Gone was any pretense of the friendly nephew. His features were contorted with rage, spittle flying as he screamed incoherently about how I'd ruined everything, how I didn't understand what I'd done. I drew my weapon, ordering him to drop the crowbar, but he was beyond reason. He swung again, wildly this time, knocking over a card table covered with zip ties, rolls of tape, and what looked like driver's licenses, dozens of them, spread out like playing cards. In that split second, I understood this was bigger than one victim. Nathan lunged at me and I sidestepped, using his momentum to send him sprawling into the plastic sheeting. Tangled around him, giving me seconds to retreat toward the stairs. Mike appeared at the top, blood running from a cut on his forehead, but otherwise okay. "Suspect in the basement," I yelled, and Mike called for immediate backup, all available units. Nathan was struggling to free himself from the plastic, still gripping the crowbar, when we heard sirens approaching. Multiple sirens. The cavalry was coming. What happened next was a blur of controlled chaos. Officers flooded the house, and Nathan was subdued and cuffed while screaming about his collection being ruined. Paramedics rushed past me to attend to the victim in the chair, later identified as Brian Morrison, a traveling salesman from Rochester who'd been missing for 9 days. As they cut him free and began medical treatment, Brian grabbed my arm with surprising strength. Through cracked lips, he whispered, "There are others. Other houses." He told me about the others. Detectives arrived and began processing the scene. Behind more plastic sheeting, they found 2 more rooms, both empty, but showing clear signs of recent occupancy. More chairs with zip tie restraints, buckets in corners, scratch marks on the walls. The table of driver's licenses contained 43 IDs from across New York State, some dating back 3 years. The investigation that followed shook Buffalo to its core. Nathan Holloway wasn't working alone, and he didn't own just one house. He was part of what the FBI later called a captivity ring, a group of 5 men who purchased properties in quiet neighborhoods specifically to hold victims. They'd grab traveling salespeople, delivery drivers, anyone who wouldn't be immediately missed. Some they held for ransom from families, others for darker purposes we're still uncovering. The Uncle Walter story was Nathan's go-to cover for any concerned neighbors. There never was an Uncle Walter. Over the next 72 hours, raids were conducted on 4 other properties in the Buffalo-Niagara region. We found 7 more victims alive, and evidence of at least 12 others who hadn't been as fortunate. Nathan's crowbar attack had left me with a bruised shoulder and some sleepless nights, but Brian Morrison was alive because we'd pushed through that locked door. 6 months have passed since that November afternoon. Nathan Holloway is awaiting trial on 37 state and federal charges. His 4 accomplices are also in custody. Brian Morrison spent 2 months in the hospital but made a full recovery and testified before the grand jury. He sends me a Christmas card now, with a photo of him and his family. The other houses on Elmwood Avenue have new families living in them, people who don't know about the basement rooms or the scratches on the walls that were painted over. Sometimes I drive past on patrol and it looks so normal, so suburban perfect, but I know now that the most dangerous doors are the ones that look like they're locked for innocent reasons. That welfare check, the one I thought would take an hour. It ended up being the case that defined my career, and every time I see a padlock where it shouldn't be, I remember Nathan's practiced smile and how evil can hide behind the most ordinary facades. These days, I always trust my gut when it tells me to look closer, to push harder, to not accept the easy explanation. Because sometimes, the person who needs help isn't the one they tell you about. The summer of 2017 was supposed to be different. After 12 years working narcotics in Phoenix, I'd finally gotten the assignment that could make a real difference, infiltrating a car wash operation that was moving more fentanyl than soap. Clean Wave Auto Spa sat on the corner of 43rd and Thomas, a gleaming facade hiding what we suspected was one of the biggest distribution points in the Southwest. I'd spent 3 months building my cover as Marcus, a mechanic with a gambling problem who needed quick cash. The owner, a guy everyone called Tio, had started trusting me with small deliveries. That morning in August, everything changed. My wife Sarah was 7 months pregnant with our second child, and I'd promised her this would be my last deep cover assignment before requesting a desk position. I remember pulling into the car wash at 6 a.m. that Friday, the desert heat already making the asphalt shimmer. The place operated 24 hours, which made sense given what really kept the lights on. I'd been working the morning shift for 2 weeks, learning the rhythm of the place. Customers would pull up, ask for the premium detail package, and slide an envelope under their floor mat. We'd vacuum the car, slip a package into the spare tire compartment, and send them on their way. Simple, efficient, and generating millions. Tio had started letting me handle the exchanges myself, which meant the case was building momentum. My handler, Lieutenant Harper, said we were maybe 2 weeks from having enough to take down the entire network. Around 10 a.m., I was detailing a Honda Civic when my personal phone buzzed. I wasn't supposed to have it on me during shifts, but Sarah was so close to her due date that I kept it hidden in my toolbox. The text made my chest tighten. Someone followed me from the grocery store, black SUV. They're parked across the street. My wife wasn't the paranoid type. In all our years together, through all my undercover work, she'd never once complained about feeling unsafe. I told Tio I needed a smoke break and walked to the alley behind the wash. I called Sarah, and her voice was steady but strained. She'd noticed the SUV tailing her from the Safeway on Camelback, following every turn until she pulled into our driveway. Now they were just sitting there, engine running, tinted windows hiding whoever was inside. I wanted to leave right then, blow my cover and race home, but that would destroy months of work and potentially put us in more danger. I told Sarah to call 911 if they made any move, then hung up and tried to focus on the job. My hand stayed steady as I buffed another car, but my mind was racing. How did they know who I was? How did they find my family? The operation was need to know, with only a handful of people aware of my real identity. By noon, Sarah texted again. The SUV had left, but not before the driver tossed something onto our lawn. She was too scared to go check what it was, and I didn't blame her. I made an excuse to Tio about food poisoning and left early, breaking protocol but unable to stay away any longer. The drive home took 17 minutes, though it felt like hours. Every car in my rearview mirror could have been following me. When I pulled into our subdivision, the normalcy of it all felt surreal. Kids riding bikes, sprinklers running, Mr. Henderson washing his truck next door. Sarah met me at the door, her face pale against her dark hair. She pointed to the lawn where a white envelope lay weighted down by a rock. I grabbed it, ushering her inside first. The paper inside was simple printer stock, but the message hit like a sledgehammer. Emma attends Sunrise Elementary. Mrs. Garcia's second-grade class, purple backpack with unicorns. Stops at the monkey bars every recess. They knew my daughter. They knew her routine. They knew details only someone watching her would know. At the bottom, typed in smaller font, "Family men should find safer work." Sarah saw my face change as I read it and snatched the paper from me. I watched her process the words, her hand moving protectively to her belly. Emma was at school right now, probably practicing multiplication tables or reading about butterflies, completely unaware that someone had been watching her. I called Harper immediately, not caring who might be monitoring the call. He answered on the second ring, and I could hear the tension in his voice when I explained the situation. "Get your family and come to the station now," he said. "Don't pack, don't stop anywhere, just come." I was already moving, grabbing my service weapon from the safe while Sarah called the school to say we were picking Emma up early. Harper met us in the secured parking garage, his usual composure cracked. He looked older than his 50 years, gray stubble on his jaw like he'd been up all night. "We've got a problem," he said, leading us to a conference room away from the main floor. Captain Rivera was already there, along with 2 suits I didn't recognize. Internal affairs. They laid it out quick and brutal. Someone inside the department had compromised not just my cover, but 2 other ongoing operations. Phone records showed calls from our secure line to a burner phone traced to a cousin of one of Tio's lieutenants. They wouldn't say who they suspected, but the way Harper kept avoiding my eyes told me enough. Someone I trusted, someone who knew about Sarah's pregnancy and Emma's school, had sold us out for what? Money, protection? It didn't matter now. Captain Rivera pulled me off the case immediately. 3 months of work, dozens of recorded transactions, enough evidence to put away major players, all worthless now. They couldn't risk my safety or my family's, and they couldn't trust that any arrest wouldn't be tipped off in advance. The internal affairs detectives asked me questions for 2 hours, going through every interaction, every person who had access to my files. Did I notice anything unusual? Had anyone asked about my family recently? The questions felt like accusations, like maybe I was the leak. Sarah sat beside me, Emma coloring quietly in her lap, both of them in a secure room while strangers decided our fate. They offered us witness protection, temporary relocation, A whole new life because someone in a badge had decided our current one was worth less than whatever they'd been paid. We spent that night in a department safe house, a beige apartment that smelled like old carpet and disappointment. Emma didn't understand why we couldn't go home, why she couldn't get her stuffed elephant from her room. Sarah tried to explain it like an adventure, but kids are smart. Emma knew something was wrong. I sat by the window, watching the parking lot, my service weapon on the table beside me. Every headlight made me tense. Harper called around midnight to say they'd executed emergency warrants on the car wash, trying to salvage something from the operation. They found empty storage areas, cleaned out. Tio and his crew had vanished. The leak had given them plenty of warning. Months of work, the risk to my family, all for nothing. The worst part was knowing that whoever had done this was probably home in their own bed, counting their money while my pregnant wife tried to sleep on a stranger's couch. The investigation into the leak dragged on for months. Internal Affairs interviewed everyone with access to the operation files, polygraphed half the department, pulled phone records going back years. They found suspicious deposits in 2 accounts, both offshore, but couldn't definitively link them to anyone. The union lawyers got involved, protecting members from witch hunts. Office politics and bureaucracy strangled any real progress. Meanwhile, we lived in limbo. I got transferred to property crimes, a desk job where the most dangerous thing was a paper cut. Sarah had the baby, our son Michael, in a hospital across town where I had to show my badge just to be in the delivery room. Emma started at a new school under strict pickup protocols with panic buttons for her teachers. We moved to a different neighborhood, told neighbors we'd relocated for my new job with an insurance company. 2 years passed before I learned the truth, and it came from the last place I expected. Harper had retired quietly, medical reasons they said, though he looked healthy enough when I saw him at the grocery store. He avoided me at first, pretending to study the produce, but guilt has a way of breaking people down. He found me in the cereal aisle, Emma comparing boxes while Michael dozed in the cart. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "About what happened with the car wash operation." I felt Sarah tense beside me, her protective instincts flaring. Harper looked broken, smaller than I remembered. He told us about his daughter, how she'd gotten mixed up with pills in college, how the debt had spiraled to the wrong people. They'd threatened her, had pictures of her at her apartment, knew her class schedule. Sound familiar? He swore he only gave them information about shipment interdictions at first, helping them avoid certain routes, but they kept pushing, wanting more, until that day they demanded details about active undercover operations. He said he fought it, tried to find another way, but they showed him a video of his daughter at a coffee shop, unaware someone was sitting 3 feet away with a gun in their jacket. So he gave them my name. Just mine, he insisted, like that made it better. He didn't know they'd go after my family, didn't think they'd care about a pregnant woman and a 7-year-old. The words tumbled out while shoppers pushed their carts around us, oblivious to the confession happening between the Cheerios and cornflakes. I wanted to hit him, to scream, to drag him to the station right then. But Emma was watching, already too aware of how quickly the world could turn dangerous. Sarah's hand found mine, squeezing hard enough to ground me. Harper said he'd tried to come forward after, but his daughter, they still had leverage. Even now, retired and supposedly safe, he checked on her every day, wondering when the debt would truly be paid. I reported the conversation, of course, filed it properly, gave my statement to the new Internal Affairs team. They thanked me for the information, said they'd look into it, but Harper had been smart. No recordings, no witnesses besides my family, no physical evidence after 2 years. His word against mine, and he was already beyond their reach. The union would protect his pension, his reputation. His daughter was safe now, graduated and working in Seattle, far from Phoenix's reach. Last I heard, the car wash had been demolished, a boutique fitness studio taking its place. Tio's organization had scattered, reformed under new leadership, the fentanyl still flowing through different channels. The system had protected itself, as it always does. They gave me a commendation for my service, a nice certificate suitable for framing, and told me the case was closed. No one was held accountable. No one ever is. We still live in that same neighborhood, still maintain our cover stories. Emma's in middle school now, Michael just started kindergarten. Some nights I wake up and check the locks, peek through the blinds at the street. Sarah doesn't ask why anymore. She knows. We survived, adapted, moved on. But trust? That's something that died in a car wash parking lot on a Friday morning in August, and no amount of time or distance will bring it back. Working dispatch for Cedar Falls Sheriff's Department wasn't exactly my dream job, but it paid the bills while I finished my criminal justice degree. At 23, I figured I'd seen enough weird calls come through the radio to handle anything. Drunk drivers claiming they were being chased by invisible cars. Meth heads convinced the trees were talking to them. The usual small-town crazy. Our department was tiny, just Sheriff Coleman and 3 deputies covering about 200 square miles of farmland and forest. Most nights, it was just me and whoever drew the graveyard patrol shift, keeping the peace in a place where the most exciting thing that happened was teenagers drinking beer behind the old grain elevator. That Friday in October started like any other. Vincent Torres had pulled the overnight shift, and he was always my favorite deputy to work with. Where the other guys treated dispatch like an annoyance, Vincent actually talked to me, told me about his kids, complained about his ex-wife, shared stories from his time in the Army. He had this gravelly voice that made even the most mundane traffic stops sound important, and he never made me feel stupid when I mixed up the 10 codes. Around 11 p.m., he radioed in that he was heading out to check the Hendricks place, an old farmhouse that had been abandoned for maybe 15 years after the family moved to Florida. We'd gotten a few calls about lights being seen in the windows, probably just teenagers looking for a place to party. The Hendricks property sat about 12 miles outside town, down a winding dirt road that most people forgot existed. The house itself was a 2-story Victorian that had been beautiful once, back when old man Hendricks grew corn and raised cattle. But years of neglect had turned it into something that looked like it belonged in a horror movie. Peeling paint, broken shutters hanging at odd angles, and a front porch that sagged like a frown. Behind the house stood a massive red barn that somehow looked even more menacing than the house, its roof partially caved in and its doors hanging open like a mouth. Vincent always joked that the place gave him the creeps, but he took his job seriously and never complained about having to patrol the more remote areas. The radio crackled at 11:47 p.m. I remember because I was watching the clock, counting down the hours until my shift ended. Vincent's voice came through clear and professional. "Dispatch, this is Unit 7. I'm approaching the Hendricks property now. Looks like there's some kind of disturbance in the barn area." I acknowledged and asked if he needed backup, but he said it was probably just animals or kids messing around. His voice sounded normal, maybe a little tired, but nothing that would make me think twice about letting him handle it alone. Cedar Falls was the kind of place where the biggest emergency was usually Mrs. Patterson's cat getting stuck in a tree, so sending one deputy to check out strange noises at an abandoned farm seemed perfectly reasonable. 20 minutes passed without another word from Vincent, which wasn't unusual since he was probably just walking around the property with his flashlight, checking doors and windows. But then the radio burst to life with a transmission that made my skin crawl. "Dispatch, there's someone in the barn. Can you run a check on—" "Wait, that's impossible." His voice had changed completely. It was tight, strained, like he was trying to keep quiet while simultaneously trying to understand what he was seeing. I immediately asked for clarification, but all I got was dead air. Then, about 30 seconds later, Vincent's voice came back barely above a whisper. "There's a man in there, but he's not moving right, like his joints are all wrong." I felt my heart rate spike as I grabbed the phone to call Sheriff Coleman, but Vincent continued talking, his words getting faster and more panicked. The next transmission came through so quietly, I had to turn up the volume all the way. "Dispatch, I need you to look up who lived here before the Hendricks family. This man, he's wearing clothes from maybe the 1940s or 50s, and he's just standing in the middle of the barn staring at the wall. But here's the thing. I can see right through him to the broken boards behind him. My hands were trembling as I frantically searched our database, but Vincent kept talking, his voice becoming more and more agitated. He turned and looked at me, and his face, Jesus Christ, his face is completely caved in on one side, like someone took a sledgehammer to it. But he's smiling at me with the half that's still there, and he's raising his hand like he wants me to come closer. I managed to find the property records and discovered that a man named Edgar Pruitt had lived on the land in the 1940s before mysteriously disappearing one winter night. His body had never been found, but neighbors reported seeing him walking toward the barn the last time anyone saw him alive. When I tried to radio this information to Vincent, all I heard was static. Then, clear as day, Vincent's voice came through one final time. He's not alone. There are others coming out of the shadows, and they're all looking at me the same way. They're all smiling with broken faces, and they're walking toward me like they want to show me something. The transmission cut out completely, leaving me with nothing but the terrifying sound of dead air, and my own racing heartbeat echoing in the empty dispatch room. For the next hour, I tried every 10 minutes to raise Vincent on the radio, while Sheriff Coleman and the other two deputies raced toward the Hendricks property. When they finally arrived, they found Vincent's patrol car exactly as I'd later heard it described. Driver's door hanging open, engine still running, radio crackling with static. His body camera had been switched off at exactly 12:23 a.m., just 6 minutes after his last transmission, and the footage showed him walking toward the barn entrance while whispering something that made the investigating officers go pale. The camera caught his final words clearly. "I know you're not real, but I can't stop walking toward you." Then the screen went black, and Vincent Torres was never seen again, leaving behind only questions that nobody in Cedar Falls wanted to answer. The state police came in to investigate, bringing dogs and search teams that combed every inch of that property for 3 days straight. They found Vincent's service weapon about 20 feet inside the barn, along with his badge and radio, all arranged in a perfect circle in the dirt, as if someone had carefully placed them there. But what really made everyone uneasy was the footprints they discovered. Vincent's boots led into the barn, but then just stopped in the middle of the floor, like he'd simply vanished into thin air. Around those final prints, the investigators found dozens of other footprints, some so old they looked like they'd been pressed into the earth decades ago. The forensics team took photos and measurements, but when they tried to match the prints to missing persons cases, they found connections to disappearances going back to the 1940s, all people who had been last seen near the Hendricks property. Sheriff Coleman tried to keep the details quiet, but word spread through town anyway, the way gossip always does in small places. People started sharing stories about the Hendricks farm that went back generations. Workers who'd gone missing during harvest season, drifters who'd asked for shelter and were never seen again, even kids who dared each other to spend the night there and had come back changed if they came back at all. The older residents remembered Edgar Pruitt's disappearance and whispered about others who'd vanished near that barn over the years. Mrs. Henderson, who lived closest to the property, admitted she'd been hearing voices coming from the direction of the barn on quiet nights for as long as she could remember, always sounding like they were calling for help. 3 months after Vincent disappeared, I quit my job at the sheriff's department and moved to Phoenix to finish my degree. I couldn't handle hearing his voice every time I closed my eyes, or the way the radio would sometimes pick up strange transmissions late at night, whispers that sounded like they were coming from underground, or voices pleading for someone to come find them. Sheriff Coleman retired early, and the department was absorbed into the county system. They sealed off the dirt road leading to the Hendricks property and posted no trespassing signs. But that didn't stop the occasional report of lights moving through the barn at night or the sound of multiple patrol car engines idling in the distance. The last I heard, they'd finally torn down the barn after a group of paranormal investigators went missing there in 2019. But even now, 5 years later, People still claim to see Vincent's patrol car parked along rural roads late at night, driver's door open, radio crackling with desperate calls for help that never get answered. I moved to a city where I don't have to think about abandoned farmhouses or missing deputies, but sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night, swearing I can hear Vincent's voice coming through a radio that isn't there, warning me about the man with the broken face who's still waiting in that barn, still smiling, still calling for people to come closer so he won't have to be alone anymore. Look, I've worked nights at the Millfield Police Department for about 8 years now, and honestly, most shifts blend together into this hazy routine of paperwork, coffee that tastes like motor oil, and the occasional drunk driver. May 2022 was no different, or so I thought. I'm Officer Patricia Webb, been on the force since I graduated from the academy, and back then I was pulling these graveyard shifts because they paid a little extra, and I needed every penny to help my mom with her medical bills. The precinct in our town isn't exactly bustling. We're talking about a place where everyone knows everyone, where the biggest crime spree might be teenagers toilet papering the high school. Most nights, I'd sit there reading case files or catching up on reports, waiting for my shift to end at 6 a.m. The building itself is this old brick structure from the 1960s, with fluorescent lights that buzz constantly and heating that never quite works right, leaving you either sweating or shivering depending on the season. It was around 2:30 a.m. on a Wednesday when Officer Martinez from Highway Patrol called ahead about bringing someone in. He sounded tired the way we all do during those dead hours when your body wants to sleep, but you're forcing yourself to stay alert. Got a woman here, Patricia. Found her walking along Route 45 about 3 miles out. She's intoxicated, incoherent, and keeps asking for a female officer. I remember thinking it was probably just another DUI case, maybe someone whose car broke down after a night of drinking, or a domestic situation where she needed to get away from home. Martinez had dealt with plenty of those over the years, and so had I. The woman would probably sleep it off in the holding cell, call someone in the morning, and that would be that. I prepared the usual paperwork, checked that the cell was clean, and put on a fresh pot of coffee. Our precinct has this policy about female detainees. Whenever possible, a female officer handles the intake and questioning, especially if the person requests it. When Martinez walked her through the front door, I knew immediately that this wasn't going to be a routine case. The woman looked to be in her mid-40s, with shoulder-length auburn hair that was disheveled and damp with sweat, despite the cool night air. She wore a floral print dress that looked expensive, but was wrinkled and stained, like she'd been wearing it for days. Her makeup was smeared, creating dark streaks down her cheeks, but what struck me most were her eyes. They were this pale green color, almost translucent, and they darted around the room as if she was seeing things that weren't there. She kept wrapping her arms around herself, rocking slightly back and forth and making these soft, whimpering sounds that reminded me of a wounded animal. Martinez handed me her purse, a designer bag that contained no ID, just some cash, breath mints, and a set of car keys with no keychain. Says her name is Jennifer, but that's all I could get out of her, he whispered to me. She keeps asking to talk to a woman, keeps saying she needs to tell someone something important. The woman, Jennifer, wouldn't stop crying as I led her to the interview room. It wasn't the loud, dramatic sobbing you might expect from someone drunk and distressed. Instead, it was this constant, quiet weeping that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her, like she was mourning something profound. She sat in the metal chair across from me, her whole body trembling, and for the first 10 minutes she just stared at the table between us. The interview room is small and windowless, with beige walls and that same buzzing fluorescent light that makes everyone look sickly. I offered her water, coffee, even asked if she wanted me to call someone for her, but she just shook her head and continued crying. Then suddenly, as if someone had flipped a switch, the tears stopped. She looked up at me with those strange green eyes, and her entire demeanor changed. Her voice became steady, almost eerily calm, and she said, "Officer, "I need to tell you where to find a body." The way she said it was so matter-of-fact, so casual, that for a moment I thought I'd misheard her. What she said next still gives me chills when I think about it. Jennifer leaned forward slightly, her voice taking on this methodical, almost mechanical quality, like she was reading from a script she'd memorized perfectly. "Take Highway 9 north for exactly 12.7 miles until you reach the old Sinclair gas station, the one that's been abandoned since 2003 with the rusted sign hanging crooked." She paused, tilting her head as if listening to something only she could hear. "Turn left onto the dirt road directly across from the station. Drive exactly 800 feet until you see a dead oak tree with a thick branch that curves down toward the ground like an arthritic finger." The specificity was unsettling. These weren't vague directions someone might give while intoxicated. Every detail was precise, calculated, as if she'd driven that route hundreds of times. Her eyes never left mine as she continued, and I found myself grabbing a pen to write everything down, even though part of me was convinced this was just the rambling of someone who'd had too much to drink. But something about her tone, the absolute certainty in her voice, made me keep writing. "Walk 43 steps northeast from that tree," Jennifer continued, her voice never wavering. "You'll come to a small clearing where the grass grows in a perfect circle. It's greener there than anywhere else around it, like the soil underneath is richer." She closed her eyes for a moment, as if she was visualizing the scene, then opened them and stared directly at me. "The body is buried 4 feet down, wrapped in a blue tarp with yellow rope tied in sailor's knots. The person was wearing a red flannel shirt and dark jeans. There's a silver wedding ring on the left hand, and a small scar above the right eyebrow shaped like a crescent moon." The level of detail was staggering, not just the location, but physical descriptions that seemed impossibly specific. I kept writing, my pen moving faster across the notepad, trying to capture every word. Jennifer's breathing had become deeper, more rhythmic, like she was in some kind of trance. The room felt colder somehow, and I noticed that the fluorescent light above us had stopped its constant buzzing, creating an eerie silence broken only by the scratch of my pen on paper. Then, just as abruptly as she'd started, Jennifer blinked several times, as if waking up from a deep sleep. She looked around the room with genuine confusion, like she couldn't remember how she'd gotten there. When she saw me sitting across from her with my notepad full of directions, her expression shifted to one of complete bewilderment. "What did I just say?" she asked, her voice small and scared again, nothing like the confident tone she'd used moments before. When I started to read back her detailed directions, she shook her head vigorously, pressing her palms against her temples. "I don't know what that means," she whispered. I was reliving something. Sometimes I see things, feel things that aren't mine. I don't know whose memories they are, but they come to me like I lived them myself." She looked at me with those pale green eyes, now filled with terror, rather than the strange calmness from before. "Please don't make me talk about it anymore. I can't control when it happens and it scares me." She clamped her mouth shut after that, crossing her arms tightly over her chest, and no matter what I said or asked, she wouldn't speak another word. The rest of my shift dragged by in this weird haze of uncertainty. I'd processed Jennifer for public intoxication, and by morning her sister had come to pick her up. A normal-looking woman named Carol, who apologized profusely and explained that Jennifer had been struggling with alcohol and episodes since their father's death 6 months earlier. Carol seemed genuinely embarrassed, saying Jennifer sometimes got these vivid dreams or hallucinations when she drank, that she'd make up elaborate stories that seemed real to her in the moment. As they left, Jennifer looked back at me once, and I swear I saw recognition in her eyes, like she remembered everything she'd told me but couldn't bring herself to acknowledge it. I spent the drive home that morning thinking about those directions, about the incredible specificity of every detail she'd given me. Part of me wanted to dismiss it as the fantasy of someone dealing with grief and alcohol, but I couldn't shake the way she'd described that clearing, the way she'd known exactly how many steps to take from the tree. When I got home, instead of going straight to bed like I usually did, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and that notepad, reading over everything I'd written. For 3 days, I tried to put it out of my mind. I told myself it was just the rambling of a drunk woman having some kind of breakdown, that following up on it would be a waste of time and resources. But every quiet moment I had, those directions would pop back into my head. I'd find myself picturing that abandoned gas station, that dead oak tree with its curved branch, that perfect circle of unusually green grass. On Saturday, I finally mentioned it to Sergeant Bennett during our briefing, trying to sound casual about it. Hey, we had this woman in the other night who was giving some pretty specific directions to, well, she claimed there was a body buried somewhere off Highway 9. Bennett raised an eyebrow and asked me to elaborate, so I read him Jennifer's directions word for word. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Webb," he said finally, "that's pretty detailed for someone who was supposedly drunk and hallucinating. You think there's any chance she was telling the truth?" The question hung in the air between us, and I realized that deep down, I'd been wondering the same thing. We both knew that our department got maybe 1 or 2 murder cases a year, and most of those were domestic situations where we knew who did it within hours. Bennett decided we should at least drive out and take a look, if only to put the matter to rest. He assigned Officer Stevens to come with me. Stevens had been with the department for 15 years and had a good eye for details. The drive to Highway 9 was quiet, both of us probably wondering if we were about to waste our afternoon chasing the delusions of a drunk woman. But when we reached the 12.7-mile mark, there was the abandoned Sinclair station, exactly as Jennifer had described it. The rusted sign was indeed hanging at an angle, swaying slightly in the breeze, and directly across from it was a narrow dirt road that looked like it hadn't been used in years. Stevens and I exchanged glances, and I could see he was thinking the same thing I was. The first part of her directions had been spot on. We turned onto the dirt road and I watched the odometer carefully. At exactly 800 feet, we came upon a clearing where a massive dead oak tree stood, its thick branch curving downward in a way that did look remarkably like an arthritic finger. The similarity to Jennifer's description was unsettling, and I felt this weird tingling sensation at the base of my neck, like someone was watching us even though we were clearly alone. Stevens and I got out of the patrol car and walked northeast from the tree, counting our steps carefully. At step 43, we entered a small clearing that made both of us stop dead in our tracks. There, exactly as Jennifer had described, was a perfect circle of grass that was noticeably greener and lusher than the vegetation around it. The circle was maybe 8 feet in diameter, and the grass within it grew thick and vibrant, while everything outside the circle looked normal for late May, a little dry, a little yellow from the heat. Stevens knelt down and ran his hand through the grass, then looked up at me with an expression I'd never seen on his face before. "Patricia," he said quietly, "this grass is growing like there's fertilizer underneath it, like there's something decomposing in the soil." We both stood there for a moment, staring at that unnaturally green circle, and I felt a chill run down my spine despite the warm afternoon sun. Everything Jennifer had told me was proving to be accurate, down to the smallest detail. Stevens pulled out his phone and called Bennett, explaining what we'd found. Within an hour, we had 3 more units on scene, and Bennett had contacted the county sheriff's department to request their cadaver dogs. The wait for the dogs felt like an eternity. We cordoned off the area and took photographs, documenting everything exactly as we'd found it. Bennett arrived with Detective Hayes from the county, a woman who'd worked dozens of homicide cases and had this no-nonsense attitude that usually made me feel confident. But even she seemed unsettled by the precision of Jennifer's directions, and how perfectly they'd led us to this suspicious-looking patch of ground. "In 23 years, Hayes told me while we waited, I've never had someone walk into a police station and provide this level of detail about a potential crime scene. Usually when someone confesses or provides information, there are inconsistencies, gaps, things that don't quite add up. But this," she gestured toward the green circle, "this is either the work of someone who was directly involved in whatever happened here, or something I can't explain. The dogs arrived around 4 p.m. 2 German shepherds trained specifically for cadaver detection, handled by Officer Miller from the state police. I watched as they worked the area, and within 5 minutes, both dogs were alerting at the exact center of that green circle. Miller looked at us grimly and nodded. "There's definitely human remains down there," he said. "These dogs don't give false positives on something this clear." The excavation began the next morning, and I was there when they found exactly what Jennifer had described. 4 feet down, wrapped in a blue tarp secured with yellow rope tied in those distinctive sailor's knots she'd mentioned. Inside was the body of a man, probably in his 40s, wearing a red flannel shirt and dark jeans. The silver wedding ring was on his left hand, and when the medical examiner carefully examined the skull, there was indeed a small crescent-shaped scar above the right eyebrow. Every single detail Jennifer had provided in that interview room was accurate. The victim was identified as Bradley Foster, a local construction worker who'd been reported missing by his wife 8 months earlier. He'd disappeared after leaving a bar one night, and despite extensive searches, no trace of him had ever been found. The case had gone cold, with no suspects and no leads. Now, suddenly, we had a body and a burial site that someone had described with impossible precision. Detective Hayes interviewed Jennifer's sister, Carol, who confirmed that Jennifer had never met Bradley Foster and had no connection to him or his disappearance. There was no evidence linking her to the crime, no motive, no opportunity. She'd been living 3 states away when Bradley went missing. The case officially remains unsolved to this day. We found Bradley Foster's body based on information provided by a woman who, by all accounts, had no way of knowing where he was buried or how he'd been dressed when he died. Jennifer herself has no memory of providing those directions, and every time investigators tried to question her further, she maintained that she'd simply been reliving something that wasn't her own experience. The medical examiner determined that Bradley had died from blunt force trauma to the head, likely from a hammer or similar tool, but we never found the murder weapon or identified a suspect. Jennifer moved away from the area about a month after the discovery, and as far as I know, she's never had another episode like that one. I've thought about that night thousands of times over the years, trying to make sense of what happened in that interview room. Was Jennifer somehow connected to the murder in a way we never discovered? Did she witness something and suppress the memory until alcohol brought it to the surface? Or was there something else at work? Something beyond my understanding? All I know for certain is that a grieving family got closure they never expected, thanks to information provided by a woman who claimed she was just reliving someone else's memories. I still work nights at the Millfield Police Department, and sometimes during those quiet hours before dawn, I find myself wondering what other secrets are buried in the places we've never thought to look. Property crimes wasn't exactly what I pictured when I joined the force 3 years ago. At 26, I thought I'd be chasing down real criminals, not cataloging stolen jewelry from pawn shops and writing reports about bike thefts. But here I was, sitting in the basement evidence room on a Thursday afternoon in September, surrounded by boxes of confiscated items that smelled like cigarettes and desperation. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in that sickly yellow glow that made even the gold jewelry look tarnished. I'd been assigned to this detail for 8 months, and most days blended together in a haze of serial numbers and property tags. The city had been cracking down on fence operations, which meant more work for me, sorting through endless bags of watches, rings, and chains that people had pawned for quick cash. My partner Jenny had called in sick that morning, leaving me alone with what felt like half of downtown's stolen goods. The pawn shop raid from the night before had yielded 3 large evidence bags, and I was methodically photographing each piece before entering it into our database. Most of it was the usual stuff: cheap wedding bands, electronics, the kind of things people grab during break-ins. I developed a system over the months: snap the photo, weigh the item, check for any identifying marks, then seal it in its own baggie with a case number. The repetition was mind-numbing, but it paid the bills and kept me busy while I waited for something better to open up. My supervisor, Sergeant Collins, had promised me a transfer to investigations by Christmas if I kept my head down and did good work. So there I was, doing exactly that, when I picked up a delicate silver necklace that would change everything I thought I knew about closed cases. The necklace itself was nothing special, just a thin chain with a small pendant that had initials engraved on it. KM, in cursive script surrounded by tiny flowers. The silver had that slightly tarnished look that comes from being worn regularly, and there was a small dent on the back of the pendant, like it had been dropped on concrete. But something about those initials made me pause. KM. I'd seen those letters recently, somewhere in the files I'd been reviewing. The missing persons cases from last year had been part of my training rotation, and I remembered spending hours reading through them, trying to understand how investigations worked. Catherine Monroe. That was it. A 28-year-old teacher who'd vanished on her way home from work one evening in September. The case had gone cold after 3 months, with no leads and no body recovered. I pulled up the digital case file on my computer, my pulse quickening as I scrolled through the details. Catherine Monroe, blonde hair, brown eyes, last seen wearing a silver necklace with her initials. The description was vague, but the timing made sense. She'd disappeared 11 months ago, and pawn shops were notorious for holding on to items for exactly that long before putting them out for sale. The accompanying photos showed a smiling woman with kind eyes, standing in front of what looked like a classroom bulletin board. She'd been reported missing by her roommate when she didn't come home from her job at Lincoln Elementary. The investigating officer had been thorough, interviewing co-workers, checking her usual routes, even pulling security footage from nearby businesses. But after 3 months with no breaks in the case, it had been officially suspended pending new evidence. When I brought the necklace to Sergeant Collins' attention, he barely looked up from his paperwork. He was a heavy-set man in his 50s who'd seen every kind of case imaginable, and his expression remained unchanged as I explained the potential connection. "Could be anyone's initials, Rodriguez," he said, using my last name the way he always did when he wanted to remind me of my place in the department hierarchy. Half the women in this city probably have those initials. Besides, that case was worked to death by Detective Whitaker. No relation, different spelling, and he's good at what he does. If there was something there, he would have found it. But I couldn't let it go that easily. The coincidence felt too strong, and something in Catherine's case file photos kept nagging at me. Collins dismissed my concerns with a wave of his hand and told me to focus on the job I was actually paid to do. That evening, I took the case file home with me, which was technically against policy, but not uncommon for officers trying to make their mark. I spread the documents across my kitchen table and studied every detail under the warm light of my desk lamp. Catherine had been a dedicated teacher, well-liked by her students and colleagues. She lived alone after her roommate moved out, worked late most evenings grading papers or preparing lessons. The night she disappeared, she'd stayed until almost 7 o'clock, which wasn't unusual for her. Security cameras caught her leaving the school building, but she vanished somewhere between there and her apartment 6 blocks away. What struck me most was a detail buried in the witness statements. A custodian at the school mentioned seeing Catherine talking to someone in the parking lot, but it was too dark to make out who it was. The breakthrough came when I started cross-referencing the pawn shop records with department personnel files. The shop owner, a nervous man named Pete Kowalski, kept meticulous records of every transaction, including photocopies of IDs and transaction dates. The necklace had been pawned by someone named Michael Torres exactly 10 months ago, just 1 month after Catherine's disappearance. The name didn't ring any bells at first, but when I ran it through our employee database, I found a match that made my stomach clench. Michael Torres had worked in our evidence department for 12 years before taking early retirement 6 months ago. He'd been the one responsible for cataloging evidence from major cases, including missing persons investigations. The timeline was too perfect to ignore. He would have had access to details about Catherine's case, including the description of her necklace, right around the time it allegedly ended up in that pawn shop. I spent the weekend researching everything I could find about Torres. Public records showed he lived alone in a modest house on Elm Street, about 15 minutes from the station. He'd never been married, no kids, and his personnel file was clean, except for a few minor disciplinary actions for tardiness and sloppy paperwork. But what really caught my attention was his work schedule during Catherine's investigation. He'd been assigned to evidence intake during that exact period, which meant every piece of physical evidence from her case would have passed through his department. The more I dug, the more convinced I became that this wasn't just a coincidence. Torres had access, opportunity, and now I had physical evidence linking him to the victim. The question was whether I could prove it without alerting him to my investigation. On Monday morning, I made the decision to pay Torres a visit under the pretense of following up on some old evidence procedures. I told Collins I was reviewing protocols for property intake, which wasn't entirely a lie, and he waved me off without much interest. Torres lived in an older neighborhood where the houses sat close together, separated by narrow driveways and chain-link fences. His place was a small ranch-style home painted an ugly shade of yellow, with overgrown bushes blocking most of the front windows. The yard was unkempt, and newspapers were piled up on the front porch like he hadn't been collecting his mail regularly. When I knocked on the door, it took several minutes before I heard footsteps approaching. The man who answered was thin and pale, with graying hair and nervous eyes that darted past me toward the street before settling on my badge. Torres invited me inside with the kind of forced politeness that people use when they're trying too hard to appear normal. The living room was dimly lit and cluttered with stacks of magazines and empty takeout containers, but it was the wallpaper that made me feel like I'd been punched in the chest. Faded blue flowers on a cream background, with an intricate pattern that I'd seen before in Catherine Monroe's case file. In one of the crime scene photos from her apartment, she'd been standing in front of that exact same wallpaper during a birthday party just weeks before her disappearance. The paper was distinctive enough that it couldn't be a coincidence. The same manufacturer, the same pattern, even the same slight discoloration around the edges where moisture had damaged it. Torres was watching my face carefully as I took in the room, and I could tell he was trying to gauge whether I'd noticed anything unusual. I managed to keep my composure and went through the motions of asking about evidence procedures, but my mind was racing. The wallpaper had been stripped from Catherine's apartment after her landlord renovated the place, according to the case notes. Somehow, Torres had gotten his hands on it and installed it in his own home like some kind of twisted trophy. As we talked, I noticed other details that made my skin crawl. A coffee mug on the kitchen counter that matched the set described in Catherine's missing property list, a small ceramic figurine on the mantel that looked identical to one mentioned in her roommate's statement. Torres seemed to relax as our conversation continued, probably thinking he'd successfully fooled me into believing this was just a routine visit. But every item I recognized from the case file was building a stronger case against him in my mind. When I finally left his house, I drove straight to the station and pulled every piece of evidence from Catherine's case. The wallpaper detail had been documented but never investigated. It was just background information in a photo, something the original detective had noted but not pursued. I spent hours comparing the crime scene photos to what I'd seen in Torres's living room, and the match was undeniable. More importantly, I found security footage from the school parking lot that the original investigation had missed. A camera angle that showed Catherine's car still in the lot at 7:15 p.m., but also showed Torres's pickup truck parked nearby. The timestamp proved he'd been there during the window when she disappeared, despite never being questioned as a potential witness. The arrest went down smoothly 3 days later. Torres didn't resist when we showed up with the warrant, and once he realized we had him dead to rights, he confessed to everything. He'd been obsessed with Catherine for months, following her routine, studying her case file to learn more about her. The night she disappeared, he'd approached her in the parking lot and convinced her to let him help load some boxes into her car. From there, he'd overpowered her and taken her to his house. where he'd kept her for 2 days before she died trying to escape. He'd buried her body in the woods behind his property and slowly moved her belongings into his home over the following weeks. The necklace was supposed to be his final trophy, but he'd panicked when he needed money and pawned it without thinking about the paper trail. Catherine's remains were recovered that same week, giving her family the closure they'd been searching for. Torres pled guilty to avoid the death penalty and was sentenced to life without parole. Sometimes I wonder if I would have noticed the connection if I hadn't been working alone that day, or if Jenny had been there to distract me. But I'm grateful I trusted my instincts and didn't let Sergeant Collins talk me out of following the lead. It taught me that sometimes the smallest details can crack the biggest cases wide open. You know how some nights just feel different from the moment your shift starts? Like the air itself is holding its breath, waiting for something to go wrong? That's exactly how Thursday night began for me. Officer Nate Callahan here. Been working patrol in rural Missouri for about 8 years now. And let me tell you, I've seen my share of weird calls. But what happened at the old Starlight Motel that night still haunts me. I was 34 then, living alone in a small apartment above the hardware store on Main Street, spending most of my time either at work or at Murphy's bar trying to forget about work. The divorce had been finalized 6 months earlier, and I was still adjusting to the silence that filled my evenings. My partner Jake had called in sick that day, so I was riding solo through the back roads where cell towers are scarce and backup is 20 minutes away on a good night. The call came in around 11:47 p.m. from dispatch. Old Betty's voice crackling through the radio like she always did when she was nervous. Unit 23, we've got reports of a disturbance at the old Starlight Motel on County Road 15. Caller says there's a woman out there acting strange, possibly under the influence. I knew that motel well. It had been shuttered for 3 years after the owner died, leaving behind a crumbling testament to better times. The neon sign still flickered occasionally, casting eerie red shadows across the empty parking lot filled with weeds and broken glass. Local kids sometimes used it for parties, but mostly it just sat there like a monument to decay. As I pulled into the gravel lot, my headlights swept across the 2-story building with its peeling paint and boarded-up windows. The place had always given me the creeps, even in daylight, but tonight it felt particularly ominous. That's when I saw her for the first time, a figure moving erratically near the old ice machine by the office. She was barefoot, wearing what looked like a hospital gown that had seen better days, and her hair was matted against her head like she'd been running through brambles. Even from a distance, I could see she was talking to herself, gesturing wildly at something only she could see. I killed the engine and stepped out slowly, keeping my hand near my service weapon but not drawing it. Yet. "Ma'am, I'm Officer Callahan with the County Sheriff's Department," I called out, my voice carrying across the empty lot. "I just need to talk to you for a minute." She stopped moving immediately, her head snapping toward me with an unnatural quickness that made the hair on my neck stand up. For a moment, we just stared at each other across maybe 50 feet of cracked asphalt, and I could swear I heard her breathing even from that distance. What happened next caught me completely off guard. Instead of responding or even acknowledging my presence in any normal way, she let out this sound. Not quite a scream, not quite a laugh, but something in between that made my skin crawl. Then she bolted. Not toward the road where most people would run, but deeper into the motel complex, disappearing behind the building where the old pool used to be. I should have called for backup right then, should have waited for another unit. But something about her condition made me think she might hurt herself if I didn't act fast. The way she'd been moving, the hospital gown, the bare feet. She was clearly in some kind of medical crisis. I grabbed my flashlight and radio, quickly updating dispatch on the situation as I began pursuit. Unit 23. Subject is a white female, approximately 20-30 years old, wearing hospital attire, currently fleeing on foot behind the motel structure. Requesting backup but proceeding to make contact. Betty's response was garbled by static, but I caught enough to know help was on the way. The back of the motel was even more deteriorated than the front, if that was possible. Chunks of concrete had fallen from the second-story walkway, creating an obstacle course of debris that crunched under my boots. The old swimming pool had been drained years ago, and now served as a collection point for trash and dead leaves, creating this putrid smell that hit you like a wall. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, sweeping back and forth as I tried to locate the woman. The silence was absolute except for the distant hum of the interstate and the occasional creak of the building settling. I could feel my heart rate picking up. Not from fear exactly, but from that heightened awareness you develop after years of not knowing what you're walking into. Every shadow looked like it could be hiding someone, and the way the wind whistled through the broken windows above made it sound like whispers. I kept thinking about how she'd moved, that jerky, unpredictable way that screamed mental health crisis or drug overdose. I found signs of her passage easily enough, wet footprints on the concrete where she'd stepped through puddles, and a few drops of what looked like blood near the old maintenance shed. The shed door was hanging open, creaking on rusted hinges, and I could see disturbed dust patterns on the floor inside. But she wasn't there. My radio crackled with an update from dispatch, but the static made it impossible to understand, which wasn't unusual for this dead zone behind the building. I was completely on my own until backup arrived. That's when I noticed the old motel sign lying partially collapsed against the back wall. One of those big roadside signs with the metal framework still intact, but most of the letters missing. Something about it looked wrong, like it had been disturbed recently. Wires were hanging loose from where the electrical connections used to be, and some of them looked like they'd been deliberately pulled free, rather than just deteriorated over time. I approached the sign cautiously, my flashlight revealing more of those wet footprints leading right up to it, and then nothing. It was like she'd just vanished into thin air. The logical part of my brain was running through possibilities. Maybe she'd doubled back while I was checking the shed. Maybe she'd found a way into the building itself. But standing there in the darkness, surrounded by the smell of decay and the sound of metal groaning in the wind, logic felt pretty far away. I was about to radio for a wider search perimeter when I heard it, a soft scraping sound coming from somewhere above me. Not the random settling of an old building, but something deliberate and rhythmic, like someone dragging something heavy across concrete. I tilted my head back and swept my flashlight beam along the second-story walkway, but the overhang blocked most of my view. The scraping stopped the moment my light hit the area. That's when every instinct I'd developed over 8 years of police work started screaming at me to get back to my patrol car and wait for backup. But I couldn't just leave knowing there was someone in crisis up there, possibly injured and definitely in need of help. I found the exterior staircase at the far end of the building, concrete steps with a metal handrail that felt solid despite the rust. Each step seemed to echo louder than it should have in the quiet night air. Halfway up, I could see the walkway clearly, a long corridor with rooms on one side and a waist-high concrete wall on the other, looking out over the parking lot. Most of the room doors were sealed with plywood, but a few hung open into darkness. The scraping sound resumed as I reached the top, and this time I could tell it was coming from the far end of the walkway, near what used to be the motel office. I started moving in that direction, my flashlight beam dancing ahead of me, when I realized something that made my chest tighten. The wet footprints I'd been following weren't just from puddles. They were too dark, too thick. They were blood. The blood trail led me down that long walkway, past door after boarded-up door, each one covered in graffiti and peeling paint that looked like scabs in my flashlight beam. I was maybe 20 feet from the end when the scraping stopped completely, leaving only the sound of my own breathing and the distant rumble of a truck on the interstate. My radio was completely dead up here, just static and the occasional burst of incomprehensible chatter. I called out again, louder this time. "Ma'am, I'm here to help you. I can see you're hurt and I want to get you medical attention." The silence that followed was so complete, it felt like the whole world had stopped breathing. Then I heard something that made every muscle in my body tense up. A wet, rhythmic sound like someone chewing, coming from the last room on the left. The door was hanging half off its hinges, revealing nothing but absolute darkness beyond. The blood trail disappeared right into that doorway. I drew my weapon then, keeping it low but ready, and approached the room with every bit of tactical training I could remember. The smell hit me first, a mixture of rust, decay, and something else I couldn't identify, but that made my stomach lurch. As I got closer, I could see that someone had been working on something inside that room. There were fresh tool marks on the door frame, and those electrical wires from the sign were coiled just inside the threshold, like a snake waiting to strike. I announced myself one more time, louder and more authoritative. "Sheriff's Department, I need you to come out with your hands visible." The wet chewing sound stopped immediately, replaced by what sounded like whimpering or maybe sobbing. I clicked on my flashlight's high beam and stepped into the doorway, sweeping the room from left to right. Empty, except for debris, and there, huddled in the far corner behind an overturned dresser, was the woman. But she wasn't alone anymore. What I saw in that room still gives me nightmares, and I've tried to tell myself over the years that trauma can play tricks on your memory, make things seem worse than they were. But I know what I saw. She had wrapped those electrical wires around her own wrists so tightly that her hands were purple and swollen, and she was gnawing on the insulation like it was food, her teeth stained black from the rubber coating. Her hospital gown was torn and covered in her own blood from where she'd apparently been clawing at herself. But her eyes, Christ, her eyes were completely lucid. Not the glazed look of someone on drugs or in a psychotic break, but sharp and aware, and filled with a kind of desperate intelligence that scared me more than anything else. When my light hit her, she looked up at me and smiled with those black-stained teeth, wire still hanging from her mouth. "Officer Callahan," she said in a voice that was perfectly calm and rational, "I've been waiting for you." I had never told her my name. Before I could even process how she knew who I was, she moved within human speed. 1 second she was huddled in the corner. The next she was lunging at me with a length of that electrical wire stretched between her hands like a garrote. I barely had time to get my arm up to block her as she wrapped the wire around my throat, pulling with strength that shouldn't have been possible for someone her size. The wire bit into my neck immediately, cutting off my air supply as we crashed backward into the doorway. My flashlight went flying, spinning across the floor and casting wild shadows that made everything look like a horror movie. I could feel the wire tightening, could taste blood in my mouth as I tried to get my fingers underneath it. She was making this horrible keening sound right in my ear, like a wounded animal, and I could smell the metallic scent of the wire insulation mixed with her own blood. My training kicked in and I managed to hook my foot behind her leg, sending us both crashing to the ground with her on bottom. The fall loosened her grip just enough for me to get a breath and roll away, but she was already scrambling to her feet, still holding that makeshift weapon. In the dim light from my flashlight on the floor, I could see more wires wrapped around her ankles, connecting to something in the corner of the room I hadn't noticed before. It looked like she'd been trying to create some kind of electrical circuit using herself as the conductor. She came at me again, this time swinging the wire like a whip, and I heard it whistle through the air inches from my face. That's when I drew my service weapon and backed toward the doorway, my voice hoarse from the strangulation attempt. "Drop the wire, get on the ground now." But she just kept advancing, that lucid smile never leaving her face, saying my name over and over like it was some kind of prayer or incantation. When she raised the wire above her head for what would have been a killing blow, I had no choice. I fired twice, center mass, exactly like we're trained. She dropped instantly, the wire falling from her hands to coil on the concrete floor like a dead snake. I kicked it away and checked for a pulse, but I knew she was gone. My throat felt like I'd swallowed broken glass, and I could already feel the bruising starting where the wire had cut into my neck. It wasn't until the backup units arrived 20 minutes later that we pieced together what had really happened. Turns out Sarah Martinez, that was her name, had escaped from Fulton State Hospital 3 hours before my call came in. She'd been committed there 6 months earlier after a complete psychological breakdown, but the facility was understaffed and underfunded, and she'd simply walked out during a shift change. The duty nurse who was supposed to be watching her was dealing with another crisis in a different wing. By the time they realized she was missing, she'd already made it 12 miles on foot to that motel. The investigating detective found her medical records the next day. Severe paranoid schizophrenia with violent tendencies, compounded by a traumatic brain injury from a car accident 2 years prior. She'd been hearing voices that told her specific things about people, which explained how she knew my name. The system had failed her long before my bullet did, and I've had to live with that knowledge ever since.